The most emotionally devastating angle in the Bass Reeves story isn't the son, it's the inversion. Bass Reeves was legally owned by the same legal system he would one day enforce. He had no name that was his own, no rights, no standing, and then, 30 years later, he was handing warrants to men who would have once owned him without a second thought. The story isn't just about courage, it's about what it costs a man to serve a system that once erased him, and whether dignity earned inside a broken institution is still dignity. That question has no clean answer. That's why the story still matters. Before you understand what Bass Reeves became, you need to sit with what he was. Not who, what. In 1838, in Crawford County, Arkansas, a child was born into American slavery. He was not given a name that belonged to him. He was given the name of the man who owned him, Reeves, the way a piece of livestock might carry a brand. His first name, Bass, the origins of which are not entirely clear, may have come from a family tradition, may have been assigned to him the way everything in his early life was assigned. He did not choose it. He did not choose any of it. Under the law of the United States of America, Bass Reeves was property. Not a second-class citizen, not a subject of discrimination, property. He could be sold, he could be separated from anyone he loved, he had no legal standing to marry, to own anything, to move, to stay, to object. Every skill he developed, every talent he demonstrated, every hour of labor he produced, all of it belonged to someone else by law. The same law that would one day make him one of the most dangerous enforcers in the American West. That's where this story begins, not with a badge, not with a horse, with a child who had no legal right to exist as a human being in a country that had written that exclusion into its founding documents and defended it with generations of carefully constructed argument. Hold that, because everything that follows gets heavier when you hold that. William Steele Reeves, the man who owned Bass, was a farmer and eventually a politician, a member of the Arkansas state legislature. He was, by the standards of his world, a respectable man. He brought Bass with him when he traveled. He appears to have allowed Bass a degree of proximity to white social spaces that most enslaved people in the Deep South would never have encountered, not out of kindness necessarily, but because proximity to powerful men required capable attendants who could move through those spaces without drawing the wrong kind of attention. This is where Bass Reeves began learning things. He learned from watching how men in authority carried themselves. He learned the specific weight of a room where power was being decided. He learned that men who commanded other men rarely raised their voices. He learned that the most dangerous people in any gathering were often the quietest ones. He absorbed all of this the way an intelligent person absorbs a language they are not permitted to speak, quietly, completely, with no way to spend what they've learned until much later. He also learned to shoot. The exact circumstances of his firearms training are not fully documented, but what the historical record confirms is that Bass Reeves became an exceptional marksman, one of the finest by most accounts in the Indian Territory region. He shot left-handed, which is significant. In a confrontation, a left-handed shooter stands differently, draws differently, presents a different angle. It makes the encounter harder to predict. It may have been a deliberate habit, or it may have simply been how he was naturally inclined. Either way, it became part of what made him so difficult to catch off guard. The man had spent his entire early life being impossible to read in exactly the right ways. The Civil War started in 1861. What happened between Bass Reeves and the Reeves family in those months is a point of conflicting accounts. The most commonly repeated version is that Bass and William's son, George, had a confrontation, an argument, possibly over a card game, and that Bass struck George. Whether this is true, embellished, or entirely invented by later storytellers, the outcome is the same. Bass Reeves ran. He escaped into Indian Territory. Indian Territory in 1861 was not empty. It was not a blank landscape waiting for history to happen to it. It was home to the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, people who had been forcibly removed from their homelands in the Southeast decades earlier, marched west in conditions that killed thousands and resettled onto land that the federal government had promised them would be theirs permanently. The federal government's relationship to that promise would prove, as it always did, to be flexible. Some of those nations themselves had practiced slavery. Some enslaved black people who had been part of their communities for generations. The situation in Indian Territory during the Civil War was layered with contradictions. Nations divided between Union and Confederate loyalty, black people navigating freedom within communities that did not all offer it equally, a geography that federal law had not fully reached and outlaws had noticed. For Bass Reeves, Indian Territory was something specific. It was a place to survive. He lived among the Cherokee, Seminole, and Creek peoples for years. He learned their languages, multiple dialects, spoken fluently enough that he could pass as someone who belonged. He learned the geography the way you only learn a landscape when your life depends on knowing it. Which trails existed, which ones looked like trails but ended nowhere, which ridgelines gave you a view over the approaches, which settlements would help a man who asked carefully, and which ones would sell him before sundown. He learned this not as preparation, he learned it simply to stay alive. When the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, Bass Reeves was a free man in his late 20s. The word free carries an enormous amount of weight if you let it, and an enormous amount of bitter irony if you're honest about what it meant in 1865. He was legally no longer property. He had no land, no documented history, no assets, no institutional support, no guarantee that any of the people around him would recognize his freedom as something real. He was free the way a man is free when someone opens the cage door in the middle of a field with no roads visible in any direction. What he had was this: he knew Indian Territory better than almost any living white lawman. He spoke Cherokee, Seminole, and Creek. He shot with either hand. He knew how to find a man who didn't want to be found. He knew how to hold a room, how to move through danger without advertising that you'd seen it, how to wait. None of those skills were taught to him for his benefit. That's something to sit with. The man who would change Bass Reeves' life arrived in Fort Smith, Arkansas in 1775. Judge Isaac Parker was 36 years old when he was appointed to the Western District of Arkansas, which had jurisdiction over Indian Territory, roughly 74,000 square miles of land where federal authority was, to be generous about it, theoretical. Outlaws had been using Indian Territory as a sanctuary for years because the legal complexity of the jurisdiction, questions about tribal authority, federal reach, and the absence of a functioning court made it almost impossible for law enforcement to operate effectively. Parker had been given a clear directive: bring order. He took that directive more seriously than most people expected. He needed deputies, not just deputies. He needed men who could actually survive in Indian Territory, who wouldn't get turned around on unmarked trails, who wouldn't be identified before they arrived, who could operate for weeks without resupply, and who could bring in dangerous men without starting small wars. He put out the word for candidates. Someone pointed him toward Bass Reeves.
The accounts of their first meeting are thin. We don't have a transcript. We don't have a detailed physical description of the room or the conversation. What we know is that Parker appointed Bass Reeves as a deputy U.S. Marshal, one of the first black men to hold that position west of the Mississippi River. That sentence sounds like a triumphant one. It is in some readings. In others, it's something more complicated. Bass Reeves was now a representative of the United States federal government, the same federal government whose laws had defined him as property 37 years earlier, the same legal framework that had allowed William Steele Reeves to own him, to name him, to decide everything about his existence. Bass Reeves was now going to enforce that framework in the most lawless corner of the country. Whether he ever had a moment where that irony surfaced, where he sat with a badge in his hand and felt whatever a man feels when the institution that once erased him is now asking for his service, no record of that moment survives. If he had that thought, he kept it where he kept everything that couldn't be fixed by forward motion, inside, private, unavailable to history. What the record gives us is what he did next. The career that followed over the next 3 decades is, by any honest accounting, extraordinary. Bass Reeves served as a deputy U.S. Marshal under Judge Parker and subsequent administrations for over 30 years. He is estimated to have arrested more than 3,000 people. He killed 14 men in the line of duty. Every instance, according to the available record, was ruled justified, the result of confrontations where the alternative was his own death. He was shot at more times than anyone counted. His hat brim was shot through on at least one recorded occasion. His belt was shot off. A horse was killed beneath him. Bass Reeves himself was never seriously wounded. Think about that for a moment. Operating in a territory full of men who were actively trying to kill him, many of whom had received advance warning that he was coming, Bass Reeves survived for 3 decades without taking a life-threatening wound. That is not luck. That is an almost surgical level of operational intelligence, the ability to assess danger before it presents itself, to position correctly before a confrontation begins, to read the specific temperature of a situation in the seconds before it becomes irreversible. He couldn't read written text. He was functionally illiterate his entire life, a direct consequence of the system that had owned him, which had made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read in most southern states. Every warrant he carried was read to him once by someone else, and then stored in a memory that apparently never failed. He could hold dozens of names and physical descriptions and last known locations simultaneously without writing any of it down. In 30 years of service, he never, according to the record, confused a name or a description. He served every warrant he was given. Deputies and outlaws both, in the accounts that survive, used almost the same language to describe Bass Reeves in the field. They said he seemed to know where every man was before he arrived. They said he could read guilt in a face across a field. They said he was impossible to ambush. They said he simply kept coming. What this means, practically, is that he was carrying in his body a complete set of skills, tracking, memory, language, disguise, restraint, timing, that had been developed over decades under conditions where every error had a serious consequence. He had been learning to survive in hostile environments since before he was old enough to understand what survival meant. The years in Indian Territory, the years inside a system that required him to be invisible and perceptive simultaneously, had built a particular kind of man. The law enforcement establishment of the American West did not build Bass Reeves. It hired him. That's not a small distinction. He was known for his disguises. This is one of the most discussed elements of his legend, and it deserves some careful attention because it can tip easily into something theatrical, the charming detail that gets repeated until it stops meaning anything. The reality of why Bass Reeves used disguise is more specific and more instructive than the stories usually allow. He was black. He was serving warrants, often alone, in a territory where significant numbers of the men he was pursuing were white, and where the social codes of post-Reconstruction America meant that a black man in official capacity was operating against a constant current of institutional hostility. He could not simply arrive at a suspect's location, present his badge, and expect the weight of the law to do the work. The weight of the law was not neutral. It never had been. So he worked around it. He arrived dressed as a farmer looking for work, as a preacher passing through, as a drifter who had heard there was a card game. He would walk into a camp or a household as someone the suspect had no reason to fear, gather what he needed to gather, position himself correctly, and then, at the moment of his choosing, he would make the arrest. The disguises weren't tricks, they were tactics. They were the natural extension of skills he had developed as an enslaved person, when the ability to be something other than what you were in the eyes of the people who controlled your life was not performance, but survival. He was also known for something harder to document but consistent across the accounts. He was scrupulously honest. In an era and a territory where law enforcement corruption was ordinary, where deputies supplemented their income in ways that would get you shot if the wrong people found out, Bass Reeves appears to have run a clean operation. He served the warrants he was given. He did not take personal liberties with the men he arrested. He brought them in alive when that was possible. He was known in the strange and brutal economy of the frontier as a man whose word meant something specific, that when he said he was going to do something, you should believe him. He built a life in Fort Smith. He married Nellie Jenny and had 10 children. He was a member of his community. He was known as a man of quiet authority and dignity, which in post-Reconstruction Arkansas was its own kind of daily courage, being a black man of visible standing in a place where that standing could be revoked by violence at any time, and proceeding anyway as if the ground beneath him were solid. He was, by the measures available to a black man in that time and place, successful. That success did not protect his family. Sometime around 1902, Bass Reeves' son Benny killed his wife.
The details of the domestic violence that preceded it, the confrontation that ended it, have not survived in any detailed form. What the record gives us is the outcome. A woman was dead, Benny Reeves had fled into Indian Territory, and a warrant had been issued. The warrant came to the marshal's office in Muskogee. Someone looked at the name. Someone thought about who would be assigned to serve it. There are accounts. The sourcing is imperfect, but the story is consistent enough across multiple tellings to carry some weight, that there was discussion about reassigning the warrant, that the people in that office understood what they were asking, or what they were about to ask, and felt the weight of it enough to consider whether someone else should carry it. There was a question in that room, even if it was never spoken directly. Do we hand Bass Reeves a warrant for his own son? Bass Reeves answered the question before it was fully formed. He took the warrant. He spent several weeks tracking Benny through Indian Territory, the same territory where he had survived as a runaway, the same landscape he had crossed 1,000 times on 1,000 warrants. He knew where a man would go if he was scared and running. He knew the patterns of movement in that land the way a man knows the rooms of the house he has lived in for 30 years. When he found Benny, there was no violent confrontation. Benny Reeves did not resist. He came with his father. What passed between them on the ride back to Fort Smith, no one recorded. No witness was present who thought to write it down, or if they were, they understood that some things are private enough that even history doesn't get to have them. What we have is the image itself. An old man, 64 years old, riding back across the territory he had spent his life policing, with his son in custody on a murder warrant, having served that warrant himself.
Benny was tried. He was convicted. He received a life sentence, later commuted. He was eventually pardoned. Bass Reeves returned to work. He took no leave that the record shows. He gave no interviews on the subject. Whatever it cost him, and it is not possible that it cost him nothing, he carried it the way he carried everything else, without putting it down where anyone could see. There is a question embedded in this story that most tellings skip because it's uncomfortable. Bass Reeves served the law faithfully for 30 years. He enforced the legal system of the United States of America with a consistency and effectiveness that almost no one, white or black, marshal or outlaw, matched in his era. He arrested 3,000 people. He served every warrant. He never failed to bring in the man he went after, including the one warrant he must have wanted to refuse more than anything he had ever been asked to do. But what was the law he was serving? The federal law that Bass Reeves enforced in Indian Territory was the same legal tradition that had defined him as property. The warrants he served were issued by a system that had, within living memory, within his own memory, maintained that people who looked like him had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. The Reconstruction Amendments had changed the letter of the law. They had not changed the culture, the enforcement habits, the daily reality. Bass Reeves was serving justice in a society that was actively dismantling the legal protections of black Americans in real time, that would not recognize a black man's right to vote without the threat of violence for another 60 years, that was perfectly capable of hanging the badge he wore on one black man while denying everything that badge represented to every other. Did Bass Reeves know this? Of course he knew it. He had lived it. He had been born inside it. So why serve? This is the question the easy versions of his story don't ask, because it doesn't have an answer that feels complete in either direction. If you say he served because it was the only way a man of his abilities could build a legitimate life and protect the people around him, that's true, but it sounds like compromise. If you say he served because he believed in something larger than what the institution had been, that sounds like faith that the evidence didn't entirely support. If you say he served because he was a man of rigid personal code who simply did what he said he would do, always, regardless of the cost, that's probably the closest to the truth, but it doesn't resolve the tension, it just locates it more precisely. The tension is this: Bass Reeves held the law to a standard that the law did not hold for him. He served every warrant, including the one with his son's name on it. He shot 14 men and made sure every killing was documented and justified. He made certain that no prisoner in his custody died before they reached a judge. He was, in the language of law enforcement, clean. The institution he served was not. That gap between the standard he held himself to and the standard the institution held for people like him is where the real story lives. And history tends to smooth it over because the smooth version is comfortable. A black hero in the Wild West, proof that the system could work, proof that talent and courage could transcend the barriers. That's the version that gets put on museum plaques. The version that's actually true is harder to carry. Judge Isaac Parker died in 1896. The court he had built, which had executed more men than any other federal court in American history, which had sent Bass Reeves on 3,000 warrants across 74,000 square miles, was reorganized. Indian Territory began the slow administrative process of being absorbed into what would become the state of Oklahoma. Bass Reeves kept working. By 1907, when Indian Territory officially became part of the new state of Oklahoma, the federal jurisdiction that had defined his career ceased to exist. He was reassigned to the Muskogee Police Department. He was 69 years old. He walked a beat. This detail gets mentioned briefly in most accounts and then moved past, and it shouldn't be. Think about what it means. This was a man who had spent 30 years riding alone into the most dangerous territory in the American West, who had tracked fugitives across hundreds of miles of unmapped land, who had arrested outlaws who had spent years evading every other law officer who came after them, who was, by any honest measure, one of the most operationally skilled law enforcement figures of his century. And at 69, he walked a beat in a city. He did it without complaint. He showed up. He did the work. Whatever he thought of the reduction, and you can imagine what he thought, he did not put it somewhere public. He was the same man on a city block that he had been in the territory. Reliable, honest, present. He retired in 1909. He was 71 years old. He died on January 12, 1910, Bright's disease, what we now call kidney disease. He was 71. He died in Muskogee, Oklahoma, in the territory he had ridden for 30 years, in a city that had grown up around the land he had once policed on horseback. His funeral was attended by people who knew him. Newspapers ran brief notices. The history books didn't run anything at all, not for decades. Here's something the biography sections tend to file under interesting footnote and then move on from. In 1933, a radio program debuted in WXYZ in Detroit. It was called The Lone Ranger. It featured a masked Texas Ranger who had survived an ambush that killed his entire company, who rode across the West with a native companion named Tonto, who operated from the shadows, who never killed if he could help it, who appeared and disappeared like weather, who seemed to know where every man was before he arrived, and who always brought in the person he went after. Bass Reeves had been dead for 23 years. The creator of The Lone Ranger, George Trenkle, and the writer Fran Stricker never publicly acknowledged Bass Reeves as the inspiration. The parallels are extensive enough that historians and journalists have been arguing about them ever since. The masked ranger and his native companion operating in the same territory where Bass Reeves had spent 30 years. The reputation for justice without corruption, the almost supernatural ability to track and apprehend, the emergence from ambush or disaster to ride again. Some historians are cautious about claiming direct inspiration. The evidence is circumstantial, the acknowledged sources are different, the time and geography overlap but don't prove intent. Some point to the specific details and find the coincidence difficult to sustain. What is certain is this: Bass Reeves held the law to a standard that the law did not hold for him. He served every warrant, including the one with his son's name on it. He shot 14 men and made sure every killing was documented and justified. He made certain that no prisoner in his custody died before they reached a judge. He was, in the language of law enforcement, clean. The institution he served was not. That gap between the standard he held himself to and the standard the institution held for people like him is where the real story lives. And history tends to smooth it over because the smooth version is comfortable. A black hero in the Wild West, proof that the system could work, proof that talent and courage could transcend the barriers. That's the version that gets put on museum plaques. The version that's actually true is harder to carry. Judge Isaac Parker died in 1896. The court he had built, which had executed more men than any other federal court in American history, which had sent Bass Reeves on 3,000 warrants across 74,000 square miles, was reorganized. Indian Territory began the slow administrative process of being absorbed into what would become the state of Oklahoma. Bass Reeves kept working. By 1907, when Indian Territory officially became part of the new state of Oklahoma, the federal jurisdiction that had defined his career ceased to exist. He was reassigned to the Muskogee Police Department. He was 69 years old. He walked a beat. This detail gets mentioned briefly in most accounts and then moved past, and it shouldn't be. Think about what it means. This was a man who had spent 30 years riding alone into the most dangerous territory in the American West, who had tracked fugitives across hundreds of miles of unmapped land, who had arrested outlaws who had spent years evading every other law officer who came after them, who was, by any honest measure, one of the most operationally skilled law enforcement figures of his century. And at 69, he walked a beat in a city. He did it without complaint. He showed up, he did the work. Whatever he thought of the reduction, and you can imagine what he thought, he did not put it somewhere public. He was the same man on a city block that he had been in the territory. Reliable, honest, present. He retired in 1909. He was 71 years old. He died on January 12, 1910, Bright's disease, what we now call kidney disease. He was 71. He died in Muskogee, Oklahoma, in the territory he had ridden for 30 years, in a city that had grown up around the land he had once policed on horseback. His funeral was attended by people who knew him. Newspapers ran brief notices. The history books didn't run anything at all, not for decades. Here's something the biography sections tend to file under interesting footnote and then move on from. In 1933, a radio program debuted in WXYZ in Detroit. It was called The Lone Ranger. It featured a masked Texas Ranger who survived an ambush that killed his entire company, who rode across the West with a native companion named Tonto, who operated from the shadows, who never killed if he could help it, who appeared and disappeared like weather, who seemed to know where every man was before he arrived, and who always brought in the person he went after. Bass Reeves had been dead for 23 years. The creator of The Lone Ranger, George Trinkle, and the writer Fran Stricker never publicly acknowledged Bass